The Open Window, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with an open window, an ordinary sight in a quiet village, barely worth a second glance. Fresh air, lace curtains stirring gently, nothing that seems out of place. Yet in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple knows that an open window can be an invitation or a warning. When troubling events unfold, the villagers insist the window means nothing at all. But Miss Marple notices what others dismiss: the timing, the view it allowed, and the simple fact that someone made sure it was left open for a reason. As she pieces together the smallest details, it becomes clear that the truth entered the room long before anyone realized it. Because sometimes, the most dangerous secrets slip in through the simplest openings. Before we look through the window and uncover what truly happened, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Open Window. The open window had been remarked upon 3 times before anyone thought it strange. Once by Mrs. Wilcox, who passed the house each morning on her way to the post office and noted, with mild disapproval, that it was an imprudent habit for late October. Once by Dr. Hammond, who mentioned it in passing while discussing drafts and stiff joints. And once by Miss Jane Marple herself, who noticed it without comment, filed it away in her mind, and said nothing at all. That, as it would later become clear, was the most important moment of all. The house belonged to Arthur Bellamy, a man of respectable habits, cautious opinions, and entirely predictable routines. He lived alone in a narrow, well-kept home at the bend of Hawthorne Lane, where the hedges grew thick and the road dipped just enough to conceal the house from careless view. Arthur Bellamy rose at precisely 6:30 each morning, prepared his breakfast with ritual care, read the newspaper from top to bottom, and took his walk at 8:10. On Sundays, he attended church. On Thursdays, he paid his accounts. On Fridays, he polished his shoes, whether they required it or not. He was, by every measure, a man who did not leave windows open by accident. Yet there it was. Wide open. Not a cautious inch for air, not a reluctant compromise with the season, but thrown back fully, as though the room within had demanded it. The curtains were drawn to either side with unusual care, their folds neat, their edges symmetrical. The sill beneath was clean. Too clean, Miss Marple would later think, for a house that prided itself on lived-in order rather than display. At the time, however, the village saw only what it wished to see. Mrs. Wilcox assumed forgetfulness. Dr. Hammond assumed a need for air. The baker assumed nothing at all, having other matters on his mind. And so the open window remained, breathing quietly into the street, revealing nothing and promising less. Arthur Bellamy was discovered that afternoon, seated in his armchair with his hands folded neatly in his lap. His head rested slightly to one side, as though he had fallen asleep mid-thought. His spectacles lay on the small table beside him, carefully placed atop the folded corner of the newspaper. The room was orderly, almost serene. There were no signs of disturbance, no overturned furniture, no broken objects. The fire had burned low and steady. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked on, marking time with patient indifference. It was Mrs. Green, his nearest neighbor, who raised the alarm. She had not seen him on his morning walk and found that odd enough to mention to her sister over tea. By afternoon, the oddness had grown into concern, and concern into resolve. She knocked twice, waited, knocked again, and finally tried the door, which opened at once. Later, she would say that she knew the moment she stepped inside. There was a silence in the house that did not belong to sleep. It was not loud, not dramatic, but complete, as though something essential had been removed. She did not scream. She did not run. She simply backed away, closed the door, and went in search of help. By early evening, the house was full. The doctor arrived first, then the constable, then a careful scattering of villagers who found reasons to pass by or linger at the edge of the garden. Curtains twitched. Voices lowered. Speculation bloomed like a late-season flower, fed by shock and sharpened by curiosity. Dr. Hammond pronounced Arthur Bellamy dead with the calm assurance of a man accustomed to such duties. Natural causes, he said at first, and then hesitated. The hesitation was small, almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple noticed it. She noticed, too, the way he glanced toward the open window, then back at the body, as though comparing the two. The constable, young and eager to appear competent, asked the necessary questions and made careful notes. He examined the room, the furniture, the hearth. He peered out of the open window and noted the soft earth below, undisturbed, and the narrow path that ran alongside the hedge. He frowned slightly, though he could not have said why. It was only when Dr. Hammond cleared his throat and amended his statement that the tone of the room changed. There was, he said, something unusual. Not alarming, perhaps, but enough to warrant attention. Arthur Bellamy's expression was peaceful, but there was a faint discoloration at the temples, easily missed, and a tightness around the mouth that did not quite fit the image of a man who had simply drifted away. The word inquest was spoken quietly, but it carried weight. It suggested delay, examination, and the possibility that the simple explanations the village preferred might not suffice. Miss Marple stood near the doorway, her hands folded around her knitting, which she had not touched since entering the room. She listened. She watched. She made no effort to draw attention to herself, which was a skill she had perfected over many years. People spoke freely around Miss Marple. They always had. She noted that Arthur Bellamy's chair was angled slightly toward the open window, as though he had been looking in that direction. She noted that the teacup on the side table was empty but not rinsed, its rim unmarked by lipstick or crumbs. She noted that the room smelled faintly of something bitter beneath the more familiar scents of coal and polish. And she noted, most of all, that the window was open despite the chill, though Arthur Bellamy had been known to complain if even the smallest draught touched his ankles. By the following morning, the village had decided what it thought. Arthur Bellamy, respectable and solitary, had died quietly in his chair. It was sad, of course, but not shocking. He had lived a full life. He had no close family. Things would proceed as they always did. There would be arrangements, polite regrets, and then, in time, forgetfulness. Only Miss Marple did not forget. She sat by her own window, which was closed against the cold, and considered the matter with the patient focus she usually reserved for difficult patterns. The open window at Hawthorne Lane troubled her. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was wrong. People, she knew, were far more likely to make mistakes when attempting to appear normal than when acting on impulse. Arthur Bellamy had enemies, though he would never have called them that. He had opinions, firmly held and carefully expressed. He had money, modest but sufficient. He had habits that irritated others and a manner that invited confidence without offering warmth. He also had knowledge, which was often far more dangerous than wealth or temper. As the day progressed, small details began to surface, carried from house to house on careful tongues. Arthur Bellamy had argued with his niece during her last visit. Arthur Bellamy had recently altered his will. Arthur Bellamy had refused to lend money to someone who had expected him to do so. None of these things were remarkable on their own, but together they formed a pattern that Miss Marple recognized all too well. That afternoon, she paid a call on Mrs. Green under the pretense of returning a borrowed magazine. She listened as Mrs. Green recounted her discovery for the third time, each telling slightly more dramatic than the last. Miss Marple asked gentle questions, never pressing, never challenging. And when Mrs. Green mentioned the open window, Miss Marple nodded as though hearing it for the first time. "Yes," Mrs. Green said, lowering her voice, wide open. "I thought it odd. He was always so careful." "So careful," Miss Marple agreed. "And did he often leave it open in cold weather?" Mrs. Green shook her head at once. "Never. Not that I can recall." Miss Marple smiled, thanked her, and returned home, her mind already moving ahead. An open window could be an invitation. It could also be an alibi. It could suggest fresh air, or escape, or nothing at all. But it always suggested intention. By evening, the constable had returned to Hawthorne Lane to secure the house once more. The window was still open, though the light had faded and the air had grown sharper. He hesitated, then closed it, latching it firmly. For a moment, he stood there, uncertain, as though he had altered something more than the temperature of the room. Miss Marple, hearing of this later, would think that it was a pity. Windows, once closed, had a way of concealing as much as they revealed. And whatever truth had passed so easily through that opening was already beginning to settle, quietly and invisibly, into the fabric of the village. The open window had done its work. It had invited assumptions, soothed suspicions, and framed a death as something gentle and unavoidable. But Miss Marple knew better. She had seen too many tragedies disguised as accidents, too many careful arrangements hidden behind ordinary gestures. As night fell over St. Mary Mead, the house on Hawthorne Lane stood dark and silent, its windows closed at last. Inside, the room where Arthur Bellamy had died held its secrets with patient resolve. Outside, the village resumed its routines, comforted by familiarity. Only Miss Marple remained awake, her knitting abandoned once more, her gaze thoughtful. An open window, she reflected, was rarely about air. More often, it was about what one wished others to see. Chapter 2. What the window revealed. The village accepted the closing of the window with relief. It was, in a small but telling way, the restoration of order. Drafts were uncomfortable. Questions were worse. With the latch fastened and the curtains drawn, Hawthorne Lane returned to being merely another quiet turn of road, and Arthur Bellamy's house became what the villagers preferred it to be, a place where something unfortunate had happened, but nothing unsettling needed to be understood. Miss Marple did not share that comfort. She had lived long enough to know that when people rushed to close windows, they were often trying to shut out thoughts rather than cold. The very speed with which normality had been reasserted troubled her more than the death itself. It suggested effort. An effort, in such matters, was rarely wasted without reason. She began, as she always did, with people. Objects could lie, circumstances could mislead, but people, when observed patiently and without judgment, revealed far more than they intended. Arthur Bellamy had not been a popular man, though he had been respected. Respect, Miss Marple reflected, was a brittle thing. It could exist quite comfortably alongside resentment. The first person she considered was Clara Finch, Bellamy's niece. Clara had visited the village twice in the past year, each visit brief, each departure marked by visible tension. She was a woman of practical manners and carefully arranged speech, the sort who preferred matters settled and emotions contained. Arthur Bellamy, by contrast, had been deliberate to the point of stubbornness. He did nothing quickly, and he changed his mind only after long consideration. Such habits were infuriating to those who wanted certainty. Miss Marple recalled seeing Clara Finch on the day before Arthur's death. She had passed Miss Marple on the lane without stopping, her expression tight, her pace brisk. At the time, Miss Marple had thought little of it. Now, she remembered the way Clara had glanced toward her uncle's house, not with affection, but calculation. It was easy enough to confirm that Clara Finch stood to gain from Arthur Bellamy's will. That much was common knowledge by the end of the week. He had amended it recently, reducing a charitable bequest and increasing Clara's share. What was less discussed was the delay. Arthur Bellamy had not yet finalized the changes. He had spoken of doing so, but had not completed the necessary formalities. Until that happened, the previous version remained in effect. Delay, Miss Marple thought, could feel like denial to someone impatient. Then there was Harold Keene, a man whose fortunes had declined steadily over the past decade. He was polite, agreeable, and quietly desperate. Arthur Bellamy had refused him a loan only days before his death, citing prudence and principle. Harold Keene had accepted the refusal with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Several villagers recalled the exchange, though each remembered it differently. Some said Harold had been understanding. Others recalled a sharpness in his voice, quickly suppressed. Miss Marple placed no weight on raised voices or remembered tones. What interested her was the timing. Desperation sharpened motives, but it also dulled caution. A man in need of money did not typically commit murder in a tidy sitting room and leave no trace of struggle. There were others, too. Mrs. Linton, who had argued with Arthur Bellamy over a boundary dispute. Mr. Peters, who resented Bellamy's influence on the parish committee. Minor grievances, perhaps, but Miss Marple knew how often murder grew not from grand passions, but from small, carefully tended wounds. And yet, none of these explained the window. The inquest, when it came, offered little clarity. Dr. Hammond testified with careful restraint. He spoke of uncertainty, of the absence of obvious natural causes, of signs that could not be ignored but could not yet be explained. The verdict was deferred. The constable reported no evidence of forced entry, no signs of theft, no disturbance of the room. The window was mentioned, noted as open at the time of discovery, but dismissed as inconclusive. Miss Marple listened from the back, her expression attentive but neutral. Others leaned forward, hoping for drama. They were disappointed. The law, she knew, was often obliged to be cautious where individuals could afford certainty. It was afterward, in the informal conversations that followed, that the truth began to show its edges. People spoke more freely once they believed official scrutiny had passed. They speculated. They recalled. They embellished. And in doing so, they revealed patterns that no single account could provide. Miss Marple learned that Arthur Bellamy had received a visitor on the morning of his death. Not an unusual occurrence in itself, but notable because Bellamy rarely entertained before his morning walk. The visitor had been seen leaving shortly after 9, walking briskly toward the main road. No one could say for certain who it was. Descriptions varied. A woman, perhaps. Or a man of medium height. Or someone wearing a dark coat. Miss Marple smiled faintly at this. Collective memory was a most unreliable witness. Still, the fact of a visitor remained. She paid a visit to Arthur Bellamy's house under the pretext of helping to sort his papers. Mrs. Green accompanied her, eager to be useful and even more eager to talk. The sitting room had been restored to impeccable order. The chair had been moved slightly. The table wiped. The air, though cold, no longer held that faint bitter scent Miss Marple had noticed before. She sat where Arthur Bellamy had sat, facing the window. From that angle, she could see the path outside, the hedge, and the small break in the foliage where one might stand unseen. It was not, she noted, a place one would flee through in haste. The ground bore no marks because it had not been used for escape. The open window had been for appearance, not necessity. Mrs. Green chattered on, recounting the inquest, the speculation, the sadness of it all. Miss Marple listened with half an ear, her attention fixed on the mantelpiece clock. It was an old piece, reliable but sensitive to drafts. When the window was open, it ran slow. When closed, it kept perfect time. "Did you notice," Miss Marple asked gently, "whether the clock was correct when you found him?" Mrs. Green frowned. "I cannot say. I did not look." Miss Marple nodded. She had not expected her to. But Arthur Bellamy would have noticed. He disliked inaccuracies, however small. If the window had been open for any length of time, the clock would have betrayed it. That evening, Miss Marple spoke with Dr. Hammond. She framed her questions as idle curiosity, her tone mild, her manner unassuming. She asked about drafts, about the effects of cold on circulation, about how long certain symptoms took to appear. Dr. Hammond answered carefully, choosing his words with professional precision. It was enough. Miss Marple returned home and sat quietly, her thoughts aligning at last. The open window had not been about air. It had been about time. Someone had wanted the room to cool. Someone had wanted the body to present a certain way. Someone had relied on the village's fondness for simple explanations. Arthur Bellamy had been poisoned, Miss Marple was now quite certain of it. Not violently, not obviously, but with deliberation and patience. The bitterness she had smelled had not been accidental. It had been masked, diluted, and administered in a manner that suggested familiarity rather than force. Which brought her back, inevitably, to motive. Arthur Bellamy's greatest failing had been his belief that being correct was the same as being safe. He corrected people. He denied them. He delayed them. He assumed that time was his ally. For someone else, time had been the enemy. Miss Marple considered Clara Finch once more. Impatience. Expectation. A future delayed by an old man's caution. She considered Harold Keene and dismissed him again. Desperation left traces. This crime had been clean, controlled, and carefully framed. And then there was the matter of access. Arthur Bellamy did not drink alcohol. He did drink tea, precisely measured and prepared. He accepted it readily from those he trusted. And he trusted his niece. The open window had revealed more than the village understood. It had revealed planning, knowledge, and a confidence that no one would look too closely. It had been an invitation to assume, to accept, and to move on. Miss Marple did none of those things. She sat by her own window, still firmly closed, and allowed herself a small, thoughtful sigh. The truth was no longer hiding. It was merely waiting for someone to insist upon it. Chapter 3, When the Window Could Not Hide the Truth. The village believed the matter finished long before Miss Marple did. Once a death had been catalogued, labelled uncertain but unremarkable, and set aside by official channels, people felt entitled to move on. Lives, after all, were built on continuity, not contemplation. Arthur Bellamy's absence became merely a gap in routine, a chair left empty at meetings, a house gone quiet. The open window, once so noted, was already fading from memory. Miss Marple understood this impulse well. It was precisely what the killer had relied upon. She did not act at once. That, too, was deliberate. People who committed careful crimes often believed the danger passed quickly. Time, Miss Marple knew, did not weaken truth. It weakened vigilance. And when vigilance faltered, mistakes followed. Her first task was to confirm what she already believed beyond doubt. She invited Dr. Hammond to tea, framing the invitation as neighborly courtesy. The kettle boiled. The cups were warmed. Miss Marple poured with measured care and spoke of ordinary things until the doctor relaxed into familiarity. Only then did she return, gently, to Arthur Bellamy. "You were troubled," she said quietly, "by the condition in which you found him." Dr. Hammond did not answer at once. He stared into his cup, as though weighing more than tea leaves. "I was," he admitted at last. "But suspicion is not proof. And proof, without cause, leads nowhere." Miss Marple nodded. "And if the cause were clearer?" He looked at her sharply now, then sighed. There was something in his system. Not enough to announce itself plainly. Enough to trouble me. That bitterness, Miss Marple said softly. It lingered. Dr. Hammond set his cup down with care. Yes. That was all she required. Miss Marple did not ask him to act. She never forced conclusions. She simply thanked him and changed the subject, leaving the truth to settle, slow and certain, where it belonged. The next step was more delicate. Clara Finch returned to the village a week later to attend to her uncle's affairs. She arrived composed, efficient, and visibly strained. Grief, Miss Marple reflected, could be genuine and still conceal other emotions beneath it. Clara wasted no time. She sorted papers, consulted solicitors, and spoke briskly of practicalities. She did not linger in memory. Miss Marple arranged their meeting with equal care. She encountered Clara on the lane, expressed sympathy, and invited her to sit for a moment. There was nothing accusatory in her manner, nothing probing in her tone. She spoke instead of Arthur Bellamy's habits, his fondness for routine, his dislike of disorder. Clara listened politely, though impatience flickered at the edges of her expression. He was particular, Clara said. Sometimes excessively so. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Especially about his tea. Clara's eyes flicked up. Just briefly. But it was enough. He trusted you, Miss Marple continued, as though unaware of the reaction. Trusted you to prepare it exactly as he liked. No one else ever quite managed it. Clara smiled, thin and controlled. He taught me. Miss Marple nodded. He would never have noticed anything amiss. Not at first. There it was. The faintest tightening of Clara's hand around her handbag. A breath held too long. Miss Marple said nothing more. She did not need to. The truth, once introduced, had a way of pressing outward on its own. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the house on Hawthorne Lane once more. It was nearly empty now, stripped of personal effects, its rooms echoing faintly. She stood by the window, now firmly closed, and imagined it as it had been that morning. Open wide. Curtains drawn back. Cold air moving through the room, altering time, altering signs. It had been clever. Clara Finch had known enough to fear examination, but not enough to avoid pattern. She had administered the poison slowly, diluted, relying on familiarity. She had opened the window afterward, trusting that drafts would explain what careful eyes might otherwise question. And she had left calmly, knowing that the village preferred peace to scrutiny. What Clara had not accounted for was Miss Marple. The matter resolved itself sooner than even Miss Marple expected. Clara Finch, pressed by routine questions and unsettled by the sense that she was being watched without accusation, made the error all careful criminals eventually made. She attempted to retrieve something she believed overlooked. The constable noticed her entering the house late in the evening. The explanation she gave was reasonable. Too reasonable. He followed procedure. He reported it. And in doing so, he provided the final piece. The document Clara sought was Arthur Bellamy's amended will, incomplete but revealing. It confirmed not only her expectation of inheritance, but her frustration with delay. Confronted with this, with Dr. Hammond's quiet confirmation, and with Miss Marple's gentle but unwavering presence, Clara's composure fractured. She confessed without drama. No tears. No outburst. Only a weary acknowledgement that patience had failed her. She had not intended violence, she said. Only certainty. Only an end to waiting. Miss Marple listened, saddened but unsurprised. Motive, she knew, was rarely monstrous. It was ordinary. Fear. Impatience. Entitlement. When it was over, the village absorbed the truth with mixed relief and discomfort. The open window, once so unremarkable, became a symbol spoken of in lowered tones. People reconsidered their assumptions. For a time, Miss Marple returned to her own quiet routines. The window in her sitting room remained closed, the latch firm. Some things, she reflected, were better observed from behind glass. If you enjoyed this mystery and want more carefully crafted stories where small details uncover great truths, remember to like, subscribe, and stay with the channel. There are always more secrets waiting quietly, just beyond the window.